Hey guys, Jordan here. Today we're taking a look at the new AMD Ryzen 9 9950X 3D2. This was kindly sent out by Scan Computers UK. If you're not familiar with them, they're one of the UK's largest retailers, offering everything from PC components and pre-built systems through to professional audio and video equipment. I'll leave a link down below if you'd like to check them out. Now, alongside the CPU, they've also kindly sent out the Sapphire Radeon AI Pro R9700 graphics card, which we'll briefly be looking at towards the end of the video in a few creative focused workloads. I'll also be covering the card in much more detail in an upcoming dedicated review if you'd like to see more. Now, the Ryzen 9 9950X 3D2 is AMD's latest 16-core 32-thread Zen 5 processor featuring dual 3D V-cache across both CCDs. Unlike the original 9950X 3D that only applied the 3D cache to one chiplet, this now expands the technology across both, increasing the total level 3 cache from 128MB to 192. Now, the big question though is whether these improvements justify the price. At the time of filming, the original 9950X 3D is available for around £539, while the X3D2 comes in at roughly £779, a difference of around £240. Now, all the testing we've done in this video was done on the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Max Wi-Fi on the latest BIOS, and I was running NVIDIA driver version 595.79. For the gaming benchmarks, I've also used the RTX 5090 and run all the gaming benchmarks at 1080p. I know every time I say that, somebody asks why would you use a 5090 for 1080p gaming, but the reason is actually pretty simple. The lower you have the resolution, the easier it is to spot the differences in the charts between the different processors. If I tested everything at 4K, most of the charts would just end up looking very similar because the graphics card just becomes the bottleneck. So by doing it at 1080p, that allows us to show the real differences in both the average FPS and the 1% lows. If you want a much deeper explanation, then Hardware Unboxed have got a great video on the subject. This isn't intended to represent a realistic gaming setup. The goal is just to remove as much of the GPU bottleneck as possible so we can accurately compare the processors. Now, for cooling, we've got the trusty NH-D15 from Noctua, along with a thermal pad on each processor as well to ensure consistency throughout the different testing. Now, the memory comes in the form of a 32GB G.Skill Trident Z kit running at 7200 megatransfers per second using XMP or DOCP, as I've also tested Intel processors. And then storage is a Solidigm P44 Pro, and everything's powered by a Corsair HX 1500i power supply. So let's kick things off with the synthetic benchmarks first. Now, these are really useful because anyone can download and run them on their own system, making the comparisons a little bit easier than gaming benchmarks where results can vary depending on settings, patches and hardware configurations. Starting off with 3D Mark TimeSpy, the X3D2 scores 35,448 points, placing it ahead of both the 9950X and the X3D, although Intel's latest processors still hold the lead in this particular benchmark. Looking at Still Nomad, things come much closer together with only a few hundred points separating the majority of the processors tested. In Cinebench 2026, we start to see where AMD's changes start to make much more sense. The X3D2 delivered the highest multi-threaded performance we've seen so far, 9,588 points, edging out both Intel's Ultra 9 285K and the Ultra 7 270K Plus. And then Geekbench 6.3 tells a similar story, with the X3D once again taking the top spot in the multi-core results. Now, what's particularly interesting here is that the synthetic benchmarks suggest AMD is trying to do more than just improve the gaming performance. Traditionally, the X3D processors have been viewed as gaming first parts, often trading a little productivity performance in exchange for the additional cache. However, in these results, it seems that AMD is trying to close that gap, making the X3D2 more of a capable all-rounder for users that split their time between gaming and maybe some creative workloads. Now, of course, synthetic benchmarks only tell part of the story, so let's move on to the gaming results to see whether that additional cache translates into meaningful gains, traditionally where the X3D processors have excelled. Starting with Crysis Remastered, the 9950 X3D2 delivered an impressive 446 FPS average along a 1% low of 184 FPS. That places it comfortably ahead of both the original 9950 X3D and the standard 9950X, although the 9800 X3D does retain the overall lead. Moving over to Dirt 2, the 9950 X3D2 achieved 359 average FPS with a 1% low of 268. Once again, the 9800 X3D sits at the very top of the chart, but the X3D2 remains extremely competitive, edging out the original 9950 X3D by a small margin while retaining a healthier lead over the standard 9950X. Shadow the Tomb Raider continues a similar trend. Here the X3D2 reaches 349 FPS average with a 1% low of 161. narrowly taking the top spot in average frame rate while also delivering the highest 1% lows of the CPUs tested. Now, it's not a huge margin, but it does show that the actual V-Cache design can provide a measurable advantage in certain gaming workloads. In Far Cry 6, we see one of the closest results of the entire test suite. The 9950 X3D2 delivers 222 FPS on average with a 1% low of 145. While the 9800 X3D technically holds the 1 frame advantage in average FPS, the X3D2 produces the strongest 1% low in the chart, suggesting slightly smoother frame delivery during gameplay. In Starfield, the X3D2 delivers 151 FPS average with a 1% low 113. This is one of the most tightly grouped results of the entire suite, with several processors separated only by a handful of frames. In Cyberpunk 2077, without ray tracing, we see an average 242 FPS with a 1% low of 160. The 9800 X3D and the original 9950 X3D remain extremely close, but once again the X3D2 positions itself among the top performers, delivering excellent gamer performance while retaining its workstation focus. When we turn ray tracing on, we naturally shift more of the workload to the graphics card, reducing the differences even more so. That being said, the X3D2 still performs very well, producing 151 FPS on average and a chart-leading 1% low of 114. While average frame rates remain close across the leading CPUs, the stronger frame rate consistency is certainly encouraging to see. So looking at the gaming results as a whole, the overall picture is fairly clear. The X3D2 doesn't deliver revolutionary gains over the original 9950 X3D, but it does consistently sit near or at the top of the charts, while offering small improvements in both average frame rates and 1% lows. Now, it's also worth remembering that some games favour fewer cores and a simpler cache topography, which is why we occasionally see the 9800 X3D take the lead despite having fewer cores overall. Now, the X3D2 is designed purely as a gaming processor. Instead, it's aimed at users who want flagship gaming performance while retaining the core count and productivity capabilities expected from a high-end workstation class desktop CPU. Now, of course, performance is only part of the story. To achieve these results, the processor needs to be kept cool and supplied with enough power. So let's take a look at the temperatures and overall power consumption as well. Starting with temperatures, the X3D2 reached a Delta temperature of 73.4 during our testing with the Noctua NHD15. That's noticeably warmer than the original 9950 X3D and the standard 9950X. But that isn't entirely surprising given the larger cache configuration and increased power budget. Despite this, temperatures remained well under control throughout testing, although I definitely recommend a high-end air cooler or a quality area if you're planning to make the most of the processor. Now, looking at peak power consumption, the X3D2 recorded 713 watts from the wall. This places it both above the 9950 X3D and the standard 9950X, but still below some of Intel's highest performing offerings. Now again, the extra performance doesn't come entirely for free, but the increase isn't unreasonable considering the processor's position at the top of AMD's consumer stack. Now, gaming performance is clearly where the X3D2 feels most at home, but AMD's goal with this processor wasn't simply just to create another gaming-focused flagship. With the dual 3D V-Cache amongst both of the CCDs, the company is also positioning it as a stronger option for creators and professionals who need systems capable of handling both work and play. Now, to find out whether these claims hold up, I wanted to spend some time inside Vinci Resolve rather than just focusing purely on synthetic benchmarks. So we'll take a look at a few real-world creator workloads with the Sapphire AI Pro R9700. Some of you might be wondering why I swapped over to the AI card for this part of the video. The simple answer is that if you're building a workstation or creator-focused system, the graphics card choice often looks very difficult for a gaming build. While the 5090 is obviously an incredibly powerful card and what people do choose, the current pricing has pushed many models beyond the £3,000 mark, with some going over £4,000. By comparison, the AI Pro sits around £1,300, making it a far more realistic option for many professionals and content creators. Now, at the current pricing, you just as well buy two of these AI Pro cards for less than the 5090, which opens up some very interesting possibilities for workstation users. And that's actually a comparison we'll be looking at in an upcoming video, as I've actually already secured a second one for testing. I'm looking forward to putting two of those against the old beefy 5090. We'll also be taking a closer look at the card on its own in a dedicated review, along with a comparison of the 9950 X3D2 with Threadripper to see whether the additional platform costs associated with TRX 50 can be justified for professional users. So rather than taking a synthetic benchmark for DaVinci, I've taken one of my previous projects, episode 5 of my Sim series, one of the most demanding projects I've worked on to date, which has multiple layers of 4K footage, color grading, audio processing, transitions, multicam timelines, and then that spread across dual 4K displays. In other words, much closer to a real world workload that many content creators are likely to encounter. Scrubbing through the timeline felt smooth overall, the playback remaining smooth even when jumping around between different sections of the project, even with both cameras in high full resolution 4K on the timeline. The biggest differences are likely to show up when it's time to export the finished project rather than when you're actively working on it. So moving over to rendering, I exported the same 11-minute 18-second project on all three processors using identical hardware and export settings. Both the Ryzen 9 9950X3D2 and the original 99X3D completed the render in 4 minutes 23 seconds, equating to a render speed of roughly 2.58 times real time. The standard Ryzen 9 9950X followed behind at just 4 minutes 27 seconds, delivering an approximate 2.53 times real time. Now, despite the additional cache found on the 9950X3D2 and the £240 price premium over the original 9950X3D, both of the X3D chips delivered identical render times in this workload, with the standard 9950X just 4 seconds behind. Now, to put that into perspective, that's about a 2% difference between the fastest and slowest processors in this test. Slowest. Now, that doesn't mean the additional cache has no value, but at least in the Vinci Resolve export test, it doesn't appear to have a meaningful advantage. If your workflow is primarily focused on video export and content creation, you're unlikely to note a significant difference between these three processors based on these results alone. Now, of course, this is only a small part of the overall creator story. We'll be doing a much deeper dive into professional workloads in future videos, including the Dual Pro AI cards that I mentioned, Blender benchmarks, more extensive DaVinci Resolve testing, and also the direct comparison between the X3D2 and AMD's Threadripper platform. But for now, let's wrap things up with a little conclusion. So looking purely at gaming, AMD have once delivered one of the fastest processors currently available on the AM5 platform. Across what we tested, the X3D2 consistently sat near the top of the charts, offering a small but measurable improvement over the original 9950 X3D, while also delivering stronger 1% lows in several games. The gains aren't massive, but they are there. Moving over to productivity, the picture becomes a little more complicated. The synthetic benchmarks were certainly impressive, with the X3D2 producing some very strong results across the board. However, with my real-world DaVinci Resolve testing, the differences were far less dramatic. Now, that's important because it means the value proposition ultimately depends on how you intend to use the system. If you're building a high-end gaming machine and also spend a little bit of time editing videos, streaming, doing content creation, or working in productivity applications, then the X3D2 makes a compelling case as one of the most complete AM5 processors currently available. But that being said, if your primary focus is content creation and professional workloads, it's harder to justify the additional £240 over the original 9950 X3D based on the results we've seen today. That's at least in DaVinci Resolve, but that extra cash just simply didn't translate into a meaningful real-world advantage. Now, I'm going to leave this video a little bit open-ended. As I mentioned, I do have the additional AI card on the way, so we can explore the dual AI Pro configurations, more extensive DaVinci Resolve testing, a bit of Blender in there as well, plus the direct comparison in the Threadripper versus the AM5. Those tests should give us a much clearer picture of where spending the additional money delivers the biggest benefit for professional users. For now though, if you are looking to get one of these processors, I will link them down in the description box below if you want to pick one up. Of course, a big thank you to Scan for sending these out for me to look at. If there's anything else you want to know that I haven't covered in this video, then please do leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you all in the next one.